Gangs of Chicago Part 2. If you haven't seen Part 1, I recommend you watch it now and then come back to this video. If you have already seen it, let's get started. In 1968, Jeff Fort got angry with the Black Panthers because they were collaborating with the Disciples and wanted influence in the Stones neighborhoods. Jeff got pretty upset and said he would kill any Black Panther in his neighborhood, but their leader got furious and went to talk to Jeff. There were some tensions between them, but after seeing the Stones' arsenal and army, they decided to make a truce. One thing we need to understand is that at that time, gangs were different from what we know today. They were social movements fighting to help communities with financial and racial problems, at least in the beginning. The Black P. Stones were the most prominent in the media of the time, demanding improvements in communities. The government then donated money to them to invest in poor communities, but other gangs like the Gangster Disciples, Black Disciples, and Vice Lords also received government money, though they hadn't asked for it. A significant portion of this money was indeed invested in the communities dominated by the gangs, especially in schools and legitimate businesses. But of course, part of the money was also used to buy weapons, drugs, and various illegal activities. The FBI didn't like this and started investigating to gather evidence. In 1965, the coalition of the Supreme Gangsters and Devil's Disciples split into two: the Gangster Disciples and the Black Disciples. Soon, these gangs went to war with each other, and it was initially very bloody. The Black Disciples were quite strong, mainly because they operated more like a guerrilla group without specific territories initially. But the Gangster Disciples started expanding into Roseland and Amersham to gain regional support, and more soldiers to fight against the Black Disciples. With so many people attacking, the Black Disciples couldn't hold out and had to retreat and establish territories. The Gangster Disciples and the Black P. Stones were on better terms, and both were at war with the Black Disciples. Then in 1969, Larry Hoover and Jeff Fort held a meeting to discuss a peace treaty between the two gangs. Initially this worked, but 6 months later, the leaders wanted to unify the gangsters and the Stones. However, Jeff would never let Larry govern with him, and Larry didn't want Jeff to take control of his gang. This started to weaken the alliance, with each distrusting the other, and everything fell apart when some Stones went near Larry's house and killed several Gangster Disciples in a shootout. This led to several wars between the Stones and the GDs. However, Larry Hoover still wanted a strong ally, so he and David Barksdale discussed an alliance between the Black Gangster Disciples Nation and the Gangster Disciples. The gangsters didn't like this new alliance because they preferred the Stones and didn't get along with the Black Disciples. So, they became independent from the Disciples and joined the Black Disciples. By 1969, there was peace between the Vice Lords, Gangster Disciples, and Black P. Stones, who together in 1970 marched to City Hall demanding social equality and better jobs. At that time, not all gang members sold drugs. Many had legitimate jobs, and in the end, the government ended up funding them and promised to create 3,000 jobs in the required regions, but it didn't even come close to that. In the early 70s, the Latin Kings started dealing heroin and increased drug sales. The gang was more focused on neighborhood protection, but over time they needed money to protect their businesses and legitimate ventures. This brought the Latin Kings' connection to sophisticated cartels, transforming the gang into an organized syndicate. However, many important members began to get addicted to drugs. Besides being a threat to the leaders, this left the Kings disorganized. Combined with wars with other gangs, police action, and drugs, this eventually weakened the Latin Kings. So they created a constitution to maintain order. Yes, a constitution for gangs. In the end, this made them more organized. Besides banning the use of any drug except marijuana, those who didn't obey the rules faced consequences or were expelled from the gang. The Black P. Stones were by far the largest and most feared gang at the time. Not in territorial terms, but because Jeff Fort knew how to leverage arms trafficking, using violence to kill anyone in his way. This created fear in all the gangs, even the Italian Mafia, who were their drug suppliers. This gave immense power to the Stones, who were getting richer and expanding to various cities around Chicago and to the south of the city, which obviously only brought more profit and power to them. But it's not all roses, right? The Black P. Stones Nation was a group that defended black rights and fought for social equality. They really did this. That's why the government had donated money for them to invest in communities, but everyone knows they used a good part of this money for drugs and weapons. So, remember when I mentioned the FBI was investigating the gangs? Well, they gathered evidence, and many leaders of the Vice Lords and Black P. Stones were arrested. Even Jeff Fort himself was arrested in 1972. But even in prison, he continued to be the supreme leader of the gang. Larry Hoover was quite happy with these arrests, but in '73, a guy named Puck stole from his allies. so he ordered the guy killed. It turns out the police found out and sentenced him to 150 years in prison. With this, David was in charge of the gangster disciples, but the following year he fell ill and died from a kidney shot he had taken years before. Most people didn't like this because David wasn't a violent criminal and didn't even sell drugs. He wasn't swimming in money like Jeff Fort and most of the Stones. Yes, even in prison, Jeff Fort remained rich. But some gangsters liked his death because with Larry in prison and David dead, there was no one to control the gang, so they could sell lots of drugs and swim in money. However, it wasn't just the disciples that got corrupted. Over time, without government help, gangs sought more sources of income, killing each other more to control heroin trafficking, never again doing positive actions for society, becoming increasingly violent in faction wars. King Papo was seen as the supreme leader within the Latin Kings, but from 1972 he started his retirement process. In 1975, after Harrison got out of prison, he helped the Stones in Uptown. Meanwhile, Jeff Fort wanted to introduce Islam to the Stones, but it didn't work out well because some were against it and others were in favor. In the end, some people got irritated and left the gang, creating the El Rucans. In the 70s, the Latin Kings were losing wars and becoming weak compared to other gangs. In 1978, the Latin Kings from Kedzie and North carried out a heist on a military vehicle transporting many military weapons from the Illinois National Guard arsenal. Obviously, this made the Kings a heavily armed gang. As a result, gang recruitment increased greatly, and the number of soldiers kept growing. This obviously scared their neighbors. So, in April 1978, Larry Hoover created the Folk Alliance, which was essentially a professional gang alliance. Among them were the Gangster Disciples, Black Disciples, Ambrose, Satan's Disciples, Latin Disciples, 2-6 Boys, Insane Dragons, Royal Popes, Imperial Gangsters, and many other Chicago gangs. This alliance later included some Crip sets. Obviously, this was bad news for the Latin Kings and any other gang not part of the Folks. So the El Rucans, along with the Latin Kings and the Vice Lords, created the People Alliance, which was essentially an alliance opposing the Folk Alliance. Soon, other gangs like the Black P. Stones, Bishops, Spanish Lords, and other Chicago gangs also joined this alliance, which later included some blood sets. The Black Disciples in the past had many fights with the Gangster Disciples. It was a matter of extreme violence. Larry and several leaders tried many times to control the violence, and over time this worked, especially after the creation of the Folk Alliance, as the two gangs had a much better relationship. After the formation of the People Alliance, the gangs that were part of it started getting closer. This helped in the trade and sale of drugs, which expanded immensely around Chicago. The Vice Lords expanded to South Shore, Roseland, Auburn Gresham, Riverdale, and Garfield Ridge. In the same year, the Gangster Disciples took over all of Calumet Green, a great drug-selling point. In 1981, Jerome Freeman officially took the position of leader of the Black Disciples. After all, since David had died, they were without a leader. The 80s were when the gangs grew immensely. The Vice Lords spread across the United States and even into Canada. Meanwhile, the Latin Kings expanded to many neighborhoods. I'll just put them on the screen. Anyway, they were massively expanding their empire along with the People Alliance, which sought more places to establish the trade of cocaine, marijuana, and heroin. Placing soldiers in the suburbs, they conquered both inside and outside the city. They also grew in other states, and even in small towns in rural Illinois. However, the diplomatic relations between the gangs were not good at all, as the Folk Alliance did not like how the Latin Kings were expanding. So, they began attacking the Kings constantly to weaken them. But this didn't work out well, as the Latin Kings used extreme street violence to show their power. The other gangs in the People Alliance didn't like this and started some conflicts among themselves. In 1988, King Papo, the leader of the Latin Kings, disappeared, probably retiring. As a result, the gang was led by BK and Lord Dino, who were in prison but commanded from behind bars. Over time, the People Alliance began to disagree on some issues and wanted to be stronger and more autonomous than the other members. This, combined with the crack epidemic, caused gangs to fight among themselves, making gang leaders targets for enemies and envious members of their own gangs, where anything could spark violence. In the same year, 1988, Eugene Harrison was killed by robbers on the street, which angered those who liked him. By 1991, the Latin Kings were becoming more aggressive, declaring war on various other gangs in the People Alliance. The Folks intervened in the conflict, obviously siding against the Kings. However, the Latin Kings believed their members were so big and strong that they didn't need allies and could fight everyone alone. Despite several wars, the kings managed to maintain their position and even counterattack on some occasions. All this was due to their military power, sense of organization, brotherhood, and complete street control. Larry wanted the Gangster Disciples to be more than just a crime organization. He even tried to make this happen, but Michael G. intensified drug sales within the gang, and the Gangster Disciples and Black Disciples started killing each other in Inglewood over drug trafficking. The wars were very bloody and only ended in 1993. However, Larry did not give up and wanted the gang to grow and develop legally. That same year, he created a project that even received some media attention. When he began to gain recognition, the government sent him to a maximum security prison to cut off his contact with the gang. This worked, and for the most part, the simple gangsters invested more in drugs and even built a large crack empire that had started in the previous decade, but only now had significant power. Over the years, the gang and its allies began to expand into various regions and overwhelm their enemies. Over time, the Gangster Disciples started forgetting what Larry Hoover said about taking the gang out of the crime world, and many newer members no longer knew who he was. This, of course, made the gang one of the most powerful and violent criminal organizations in Chicago. Curiosity, ZNP. In recent years, all the gangs spread throughout the United States and all the states of Illinois. The Latin Kings themselves spread to other countries, mainly in Central America and Latin countries. Mexico and Guatemala were the countries with the most Latin Kings presence. However, they were not only in Central American countries. There are even members of the gang in Brazil. The Latin Kings have about 50,000 members spread across all their territories in various countries. It may seem like a small number, but think about it. 50,000 people causing trouble at your doorstep. That's a lot of people. They really are a huge and significant gang in the crime world. Many people think the Latin Kings and the Vagos from GTA San Andreas are the same gang, or that the Vagos were inspired by the Kings. But no, they are not the same gang. Sure, both use yellow and are Latin gangs, but they are not the same. This is something we'll explain in a future video I'm going to make on the channel, and I invite you to subscribe to stay updated on everything about gangs in a way no one on YouTube does.